What's up everybody, Danny's here and we are back at it again with another video. But before we get into it, make sure you check out all the links in the description below. So today, I noticed that I want to talk about some games that should definitely come to the Nintendo Switch, but I've noticed something. Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3 are similar to the Donkey Kong games for the SNES, but what I'm noticing right now is that I wanted to see Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance remake to come to the Nintendo Switch. Now, I noticed that Donkey Kong Country 3 is not on the Game Boy, but it is on the Game Boy Color eventually, but it's on like a Japanese version of Donkey Kong Land 3, but it's also on the Game Boy Advance, Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance, and also Donkey Kong Country 2 and 1 for the Game Boy Advance. And I also wanted to see Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2 for the Game Boy Color for the Nintendo Switch. Now, pretty much though, now that we have like Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 for the SNES on the Switch, I would recommend that Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance should definitely come to the Nintendo Switch. Now, definitely though, Nintendo did a remake version of Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color, and Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, and Donkey Kong Country 3. But Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 were also known as Diddy's Kong Quest and Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Now, I really like these games though, pretty much though. I actually like the first Donkey Kong game. It was eventually one of my favorites at this point. But to consider it done, Nintendo did some work on these games. Now imagine if Nintendo would be able to put in these Donkey Kong games to the Nintendo Switch. And I believe that I noticed something, that Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3, Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3 were on the original Game Boy. And also, they have Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 for the SNES and for the Game Boy Color and for the Game Boy Advance, which is kind of cool though, because I know that it's kind of similar to the SNES game, to the SNES version, but the SNES version looks kind of similar to the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance version, but the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance versions of Donkey Kong Country games are similar to the SNES games. They have like the same levels of Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3, but I noticed that Donkey Kong Land has some different levels. Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3, they have different levels, but the gameplay and the characters, it looks kind of similar to the SNES versions of Donkey Kong Country, but also what looked kind of similar would be the gameplay of Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3, because with the SNES version and the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance version, they have similar gameplay. They have like the same levels, but they did a remade version of Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color, which looked kind of similar, and I actually liked it, which is kind of cool to see. To compare which game is better, the old version or the remake version, just kind of like what remakes they had for the Nintendo Switch, like Mario Kart 8 and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe for the Wii U and for the Nintendo Switch, which is kind of similar to see. And it's easier to see what version do people like for a video game version that was remade, either the old version or the new version, but I simply like the old version of video games back in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. And they've also did remakes for the Switch, which is kind of cool though. But I bet that if the Nintendo Switch 2 comes out, we may be getting some remakes, hopefully though, just like what we had for the Nintendo Switch. There's a lot of remakes that were released on the Switch. I'm gonna truly be honest, it was the best console. But anyways, I think that will wrap it up here for today's video. I really hope you guys do enjoy the video. If you do, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe if you are new to this channel. Make sure to hit that bell notification every time you get notified when I post a video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.